Welcome to our Tech Talk today, sponsored by Quest Software. Today's Tech Talk is on COVID-19 and its impact on Office 365 services and how to enable your remote workforce. So right now, you're either in the fire of enabling your suddenly remote workforce or you're already over that initial hump. You flipped on a bunch of Office 365 services and now you're flying fast, making sure people can use them effectively and securely. That's why we wanted to offer something else of value, hearing directly from a Microsoft MVP, Most Valuable Professional, the Experts Conference speaker, and Petrie.com contributor Tony Redmond. He's going to be talking about the impact COVID-19 is having on Microsoft's ability to deliver their services in the face of a 775% increase in demand, and outline the management implications of moving and combining chat, voice, video, and file sharing into a single platform. Tech Talks are not Quest product pitches. They're pure training in the spirit of our Active Directory and Office 365 training conference called the Experts Conference, or TEC. A Tech Talk is just like our Tech Conference, training you can use with no third-party pitches. So what is the Experts Conference? In 2019, Tech returned after a 7-year hiatus, and it was amazing, sold-out success. This year, we're taking Tech 2020 to the next level. So along with our hybrid Active Directory security and Office 365 tracks, we're adding a third track called Migration and Modernization. We also have carved out time for networking and interaction with those industry experts and your peers, folks like Tony Redmond, today's speaker, Sean Metcalf, Microsoft Certified Master, Windows Security Expert Randy Franklin-Smith, Microsoft Teams Product Manager Chris McNulty, David Kennedy, founder of TrustedSec, who's testified before Congress on national security and appeared on several national news and TV shows. We've got over 30 speakers ranging from Microsoft employees, Microsoft MVPs, to independent industry experts. So you're sure to get the technical insights on Microsoft technologies you're looking for. Tech 2020 is slated for November 17th through the 18th at the Loews Hotel in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia. We are optimistic that COVID-19 will be contained before Tech 2020, but we also understand that this is a new experience for everyone. We're planning for every possibility, and therefore we are also offering a full refund to anyone who requests it by November 3rd, 2020. This way you can register now, take advantage of registration discounts while ensuring a full refund should any changes on your part need to happen. We're also adding a pre-conference day for Quest product training around the Quest Active Directory Recovery and Quest Active Directory Auditing solutions and specific recovery and auditing scenarios. So while Tech itself has no third-party pitches, there is a pre-conference day that is very much dedicated to those specific Quest lines. So if you are looking at those products or you own those already, this is certainly a place to come and get hands-on training and scenario-based training. So to learn more about the Experts Conference, please visit theexpertsconference.com and register today for the early bird pricing before Tech 2020 sells out. Now on to today's speaker. Tony Redmond runs his own consulting company. He is a lead author for the Office 365 IT Pros ebook series. He writes twice weekly for Petrie.com, covering all things Office 365. He is a frequent speaker at conferences, including our own Experts Conference, as you see here on the screen. We're really excited that he is here to share his experience and what he's seeing on the impact that the surge in Office 365 usage is having on Microsoft's ability to deliver those services. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tony to dive into today's topic. We will take Q&A at the end. So Tony, welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. But I think the most important thing about MVPs that I ever heard in terms of defining what they are is that they're called independent experts. We're not there to champion Microsoft technology. We give Microsoft actually a hard time a lot of the time about the deficiencies that are in their technology, and we try and work out on a very productive level, proactive level to how they can improve matters. While I've got people here, let me start off by just giving you one big piece of advice as you scale up Office 365 to deal with what we're dealing with right now. That is, take a look at conditional access policies. And if you're not using them, make sure that you start considering at least using the conditional access policies to make sure that you keep your tenants safe. And please, please, please enable multi-factor authentication. Microsoft will tell you that 99.9% of the basic attacks that are made against Office 365, especially against Exchange Online, are deflected or stopped dead in the water by accounts having MFA enabled. So right now, today, there's only about 12% of Office 365 accounts with MFA enabled. It's a shame, it's a disgrace. It shouldn't happen. So if you take anything away from this session, please go and enable MFA. So with that, let's get on. So I've got two sets of slides, the slides are divided into two parts. First part is just talking about what's happening inside Office 365 now at the moment, what kind of stresses and strains are on the service, and how you might see that. And then the second part, we'll talk a little bit about how Office 365 is developing as it approaches the second decade of an Office Cloud service. So please put in your questions, and we'll get to answer them later on. Okay, so let's move on. Technology is once again escaping me as the slides are refusing to move. Oh no, here we go. All right, so everybody on this call knows that we're all living under a huge pandemic at the moment, which is driving an enormous amount of need to work from home. We're getting it because the governments are telling us to stay at home. Here in Ireland, where I am right now, we're not allowed to move more than 2 kilometers from our house. But the good thing is that because the internet has improved dramatically over the last number of years, by that I mean the home internet service, also backbone service, and because we now have a very robust cloud services infrastructure, people can actually do it. And I mean, the point is, for example, that Microsoft over the last number of years has deployed literally thousands of point-to-presence connectors to allow people to make a very close connection to the Microsoft backbone. And once data gets into the backbone, it gets routed very, very quickly to all the various data centers that make up Office 365. If you look at the actual usage patterns, Microsoft came out last week and said 775% increase in cloud services generally. Now that is spread across all of their cloud properties, and a lot of it was in Azure. But the one that is really interesting from an Office 365 perspective is what happened with Teams. Teams has been growing quite nicely. It's at a really good growth curve over the last while. But you know, if you were to look back at Teams 2 weeks ago, you say it was about 30 million users, which, to put it into perspective, is really only 15% of the Office 365 installed base. And then bang, work at home took off. Now all of a sudden, Teams increased by 37.5% in a week. So you now get this thing of 44 million daily active users connecting to Teams. Now, daily active user means that somebody does something during the day. It's not just a matter of logging onto Teams. It's a matter of they have to schedule a meeting, they have to read a message, they have to join a meeting, they have to take some sort of action that they have to explicitly make rather than implicitly perform, as in the case of a logon. Why Teams is so interesting is because Teams is built on the top of so many other parts of Office 365. So the growth in Teams automatically drove a huge growth in Exchange, in SharePoint, in OneDrive, in Planner, and all the other bits that get connected into a Teams ecosystem. SharePoint is probably the heaviest because, of course, every team that's created comes with the SharePoint site, and all of that sort of stuff that has to do with Spa. Another interesting factor is that we've seen some companies clock up increases in 100%. In fact, I saw one at 3,081% growth in the number of meetings held over a 1 week period. And that kind of increase in an infrastructure doesn't only just stress the cloud infrastructure that you're connecting to, but it also impacts your own network, because clearly data has got to get in and out of the cloud. Microsoft says there's 900 million minutes daily of meetings and calls. Now, that actually isn't all that much per active user, but it's increasing all the time. In fact, it's increasing so much that Microsoft is accelerating plans to introduce a new codec to make that calling and signaling experience a lot better. So as I said earlier, we have seen some increase as well in SharePoint, OneDrive, and also Stream. Stream is kind of interesting because a lot of these meetings that are happening are corporate meetings. Corporate meetings tend to be recorded. Once they're recorded in Teams, there's a bot that actually hands off the meeting to Stream. And once it gets to Stream, the recording is processed. So it's processed for auto captioning. It's also processed so that different versions of the video is created for playback on different devices. You know, if you were to play back something on a candy phone, candy bar shaped phone, or an iPhone or whatever, you get a different experience than if you play back a stream video on a PC or a Mac. So the interesting thing here is that when you as a tenant are set up for Stream, you get a storage allocation of 500 gigabyte plus a half a gigabyte per active user, per licensed user. And if you are recording Stream videos for Teams meetings, you're going to run out of that allocation quite quickly if you don't keep your eye on it. Microsoft at one point gave a guidance of about 2.5 megabyte per minute of recording. And in fact, with Teams meeting recordings, it's turning out to be more like 7.5 gigabytes. So just keep an eye on that for your own benefit. So with all of this increase in demand, it's clear that the service is not going to be running quite as smoothly as it did. The interesting thing is that things have worked better than you might have predicted. And that's testimony to a couple of things. I think firstly, you've got the fact that Office 365 is spread out across the world to 17 different data center regions. And it's got tons and tons of machine resources. A lot of those machine resources were actually put into deal with artificial intelligence and machine learning, but these resources are available to be repurposed. And one of the interesting aspects of Office 365 is that the degree of automation that exists within the service allows Microsoft to swap workloads to machines very, very, very quickly. So what we're seeing at the moment is two things really. Firstly, Microsoft is rebalancing workloads. It's rebalancing the resources that are dedicated to the demand created by customers. And the second thing internally within applications, it's also tuning things back so that the applications themselves are not generating as much demand as they did before. And the logic here, of course, is that it's much more important to provide a service to end users who want to do something rather than a background process that needs to do something because it's nice to do it. Now, you can argue about whether or not that background processing is really important and needs to have equal priority. But the fact is that an awful lot of the changes that Microsoft have made and continue to make are in tuning. So, for example, the cache to data is not refreshed as often. In Teams, you have to type more characters before an address is validated. Background processing for things like SharePoint for data loss prevention is now slower than it used to be, because when you upload new documents to SharePoint, those documents need to be processed, they need to be indexed, and that's done by a background crawler. Part of that crawling process is to check the document against data loss prevention policies. That used to happen quite quickly. Maybe you could always have a guarantee of maybe happen within 10 minutes of a new document being uploaded. Now it might take half an hour or an hour. You also see things like Stream has reduced its video resolution down from 1080p to 720p for meeting recordings. I don't think that's a great problem. OneNote has been made read-only. Again, I don't think that's a huge problem. But the point is that collectively there's a huge number of changes to be made across Office 365 with the intention that users don't notice that things are really all that much difference, but collectively all the changes that are made to rebalance hardware, to reassign resources, to tune back background processing and so forth and so on, it will release resources to take on the extra workload. Just to give you a feeling of the amount of background processing that goes on inside Office 365. If you take Exchange Online, there are well over 200,000 mailbox servers running Exchange Online, maybe 250,000 today. Each of those servers has maybe 100 background assistants running, and they're running to do things like apply retention policies, to count the number of users that are in Office 365 groups and distribution lists and so forth and so on. Whole pile of things, to check calendar meetings. You name it, there's a background assistant on. Those assistants are all being tuned back. And so if you think of, if you tune back the demand of an assistant by 50% for 100 assistants, that's a lot of CPU cycles you've just released. If you scale it up to 250,000 servers, that's a hell of a lot of cycles that you've released. So we're not going. Microsoft is obviously not only making maximum use of its existing resources, it's also bringing on new servers, new storage. This is an ongoing process. Microsoft is a very, very active group of people who try and predict demand. They couldn't have predicted demand caused by the pandemic, but there are lots of people who are trying to predict what's likely to be the growth curve for Office 365 over time as they open up new data center regions in individual countries to handle data sovereignty and just to handle the ongoing load created by new users. Every month for the last 60 odd months, Office 365 has taken on about 3 million new users. So this is an ongoing process. It's something that never really stops. And Microsoft is out there buying tons of servers, tons of storage, and commissioning them as quickly as possible. But as they are moving faster than ever before to try and keep up with the demand, clearly we're going to see over the next while, we're going to see a reduction in background processes that we've just described. You're also going to see probably some more transient errors occurring. You may not see them as a user because things like, for example, cached exchange mode in Outlook will hide this from you for email. But if you were a programmer, or if you were something like an ISV like Quest, and you're running migrations, you're likely to see a lot more transient errors pop up as strain goes on. Because of course, when you're doing migrations, a lot more data is moved around than at almost any other time. And there's a lot of read activity, but there's also a ton of write activity. And that's the kind of thing that where you see those type of errors. And we've seen that with being reported by quite a lot of ISVs. I think also we'll see Microsoft throttle back a little on their focus on machine learning, because quite honestly, right now, instead of trying to get artificial intelligence and a ton of machine learning into as many places inside Office 365 as they can fit, I think it's a matter of keeping the lights on, keeping everything going, making sure that they deliver the service to users as committed. In terms of numbers, I think The last time we saw a public number for Microsoft in October is about 200 million daily active users for Office 365. With the predicted growth, we would expect to see another figure given to us in their next set of results, which will be around the 28th of April, I think, sometime like that, maybe 25th. We'd expect to see 6 months growth of about 3.5 million, call it to 20 million. That would take us up to 220. With the extra growth, we could be at 240 million daily active users. That's the scale of the thing that Microsoft is trying to deal with right now. It's kind of interesting to say the least. Okay, so that's what I have to say about what's happening at the moment. If anybody's got any questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, I'll plunge in and talk about where Microsoft is going with Office 365.
Hey Tony, I don't see any questions specifically right now for this, for what you just talked about, but for the attendees, I did in the chat. If you scroll up, you'll see I added 2 links to 2 of Tony's articles. One is about Microsoft imposes restrictions on Office 365 services to ease demand. The other one is Office 365 suffers temporary scaling problems. So some of the things Tony just spoke about, but you can access his articles there as well and share them around with your colleagues.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so let's talk about Microsoft 365 and the substrate and stuff like that.
Actually, Tony, can I interrupt 1 second? One question did come in, and so in order to make sure we answer these, let me ask this one. Regarding stress to the online services, are the assistants you mentioned that support the 200,000 or so Exchange servers running Exchange as well, or are they VMs or containers providing compute resources?
No, that's a great question. So Microsoft does not use virtual machines inside Office 365 at all. It doesn't use containers. It uses good old-fashioned physical hardware. And there are 2 major reasons for this. The first is that their provisioning model is very simple. They take servers offline, they reduce the servers down to bare metal, and then they pour a build of whatever workload package they want to support on it, like an Exchange server or a SharePoint server or Teams, whatever. They just pour it on, and that server goes on, that package goes on with all of the updates, the latest build, whatever it is. So they've got a very, very simple model. There's not a case of going around to 250,000 mailbox servers and applying the latest cumulative update. That is not what happens. You have about 10% of the server population going through that kind of upgrade cycle on an ongoing basis. It's probably a little bit less now because they're keeping more servers online. This allows then Microsoft to say that they have all of the servers are 99.9 something high figure percentage of the servers all running the same software. It's very important to get consistency across Office 365. But they'll tell you that there's a few renegade servers out there that might have slipped through the cracks. But the second reason why they don't use virtualization, even though they have Hyper-V, they have their own product here, is because simplicity is absolutely critical when you're running operations at this kind of scale. And if you go and talk to the Office 365 architects, the guys who actually have to run this monster infrastructure, they'll tell you that there is no way they want to introduce an added layer of complexity, which virtualization represents, into their operations. They'd like to keep things really, really simple. So that's the reason why they don't run virtualized servers and they don't use containers. Now, things might change in the future. It's always possible. I think Microsoft will keep an eye on the economics of the situation to make a decision about where they make future decisions. I have heard some people speculate that containers might be a good thing to do. But again, they have to weigh off the added complexity that bringing in additional layers introduces into their operating model and figure out whether or not they can get more advantage by introducing that added complexity than they do by keeping it simple as they do today. That sound reasonable? Yep. Any other questions?
That's it for right now. Thanks, Tony.
Okay. Everybody's gone to sleep. Great. Okay. So the next section I wanted to talk about where Microsoft is going with this Cloud Office system and what's really driving them. It's a good time to look back because we're approaching the second decade of Office 365. Those of you that might know a little bit about the history will know that it was launched in 2011, June 2011, in New York City, as it happens, by Steve Ballmer. And so there's a lot of experience being gained, and there's a lot of scale, as we've obviously discussed. So where are they going? Well, so if we will look back and we look at where Office 365 came from, it had its roots very much in the on-premises world, the Windows Server world. You guys who run Windows servers and Active Directory, you know what it's like. Basically, an on-premises deployment is connected by an internal network, but the actual links between the applications themselves is pretty disconnected. It's impossible really to build much dependency between, say, Exchange 2016 and SharePoint 2016. That just doesn't tend to happen in the on-premises world. It's just too difficult to make sure that everything's got the same service pack, cumulative update. You've got the various authentication stuff like that between the various applications to make sure the data can pass together. So the on-premises world, when we look at it, is very, very different to what we see in the cloud. It was the same early days. In 2011, we had Exchange Online, which was basically Exchange 2010 with a little bit of added administration. Same for SharePoint 2010. Same for Office Communication Server and then Link Server. These were classic on-prem applications, engineered for on-prem, developed, used, deployed, managed on-prem, and developed and deployed in a way that there wasn't a lot of interaction. But what's changed over the last 9 or so years is that we're seeing that Office 365 is really a software toolbox. And what this means is that Microsoft's focus now is leveraging all of the bits of Office 365 as much as possible in as intelligent way as possible to build new applications and new experiences to deliver to customers. So it's a different world, and it's a different kind of environment for people to work in. It's a different kind of environment for engineers, particularly, to work in, because you might have people who work for 10 or 20 years on Exchange or SharePoint or whatever, and their view of life is very much, okay, it's whatever Exchange or SharePoint could do. And now it's a case of, well, Exchange isn't really the center of the ecosystem anymore. Exchange is much more a bit player within Office 365. It's a very important bit player from a storage perspective, which we'll talk about in a little while, but also from the delivery of email services. The same thing for SharePoint. SharePoint, if you go to a SharePoint show or whatever, you'll see tons of people that have built a business in the SharePoint ecosystem with add-ons for SharePoint, et cetera, et cetera. That works really well as SharePoint on-prem, but in the cloud, SharePoint is really just the Office 365 document management service. And that kind of change takes a lot of getting over with. But that's what Microsoft is trying to do. They have built this infrastructure, and now they are focusing on how to develop it further, and most of all, how to exploit what they have gathered. So this is a diagram I did up after listening to a talk by Jeffrey Snover at last year's Ignite. Jeffrey is a good mate. He and I used to work together at Digital Equipment. He is the architect or one of the big architects for Office 365, with a specific focus on artificial intelligence, the introduction of artificial intelligence, machine learning, those type of techniques into Office 365. Jeffrey's probably best known for he's the father of PowerShell. He's the guy who brought that scripting and automation capability to Windows Server. But anyway, Jeffrey was trying to explain to people what the substrate was. Now, the substrate is a term that Microsoft has been using for a number of years, but really didn't use outside Microsoft when they're talking to customers. The way Jeffrey was trying to describe it is he said you can think of Office 365 as an operating system where you've got basic objects, basic servers, and basic apps. And he said this is what we've built with Office 365, so that we have piles of different objects that people interact with, just documents and email and meetings and tasks and whatever. Those objects are exposed through various services, some of which are very well known, like the applications, Exchange and SharePoint. Some of them are the apps like Microsoft Graph API, Exchange Web Services, CSON, etc. And then you've got this thing in the middle, which is this graph that's built of graph of trillions of data points in it, which marks all the connections and interactions between all of the different services. And then on top of it, you've got all these apps, which is what end users access to actually interact with all of the information behind. But the basic thing is to build the substrate, build the objects, build where they're stored, where they're indexed, where they're processed, where they're dealt with in common. Now, there's a technical challenge here, of course, straight up, because when you think of it, well, okay, so Exchange uses the JET database, ESE database engine. SharePoint uses Azure SQL. Teams uses Cosmos DB. How are we going to bring all those together? How do I get for example, an indexing capability across all of those platforms, so that I can perform a search and find things? How do I put stuff in one place so that retention is processed in a consistent manner? And what's really happening over the last while is that the substrate has been developing based on Exchange storage. ESE has always been a very flexible database engine. It's an engine that can store just about anything, as you know, because if you look at what email people send and the attachments they add to email. And what's happening is that you see that stuff that people are working on are now stored in mailboxes. Some of them are in parts of user mailboxes that are visible. Some of them parts of user mailboxes that are invisible. And some of them are in special mailboxes that are totally invisible, which Microsoft sometimes calls shards. Other people call them phantom mailboxes. But you can see the documents are stored there if they're created in SharePoint or OneDrive. Teams chats and channel conversations, copies of them are stored there. You got Exchange messages, you got tasks, the tasks created by To-Do or Outlook or Teams, and so forth and so on. Everything is stored now in the substrate. And the substrate is then the one place Microsoft can apply artificial intelligence through, can apply indexing and search against, can apply information protection to secure information, and so forth and so on. So it's actually a compelling vision, but it's a vision that could only come about because Office 365 is becoming closer and closer as time goes by. So in essence, this is it. This is what the influence of the substrate is. We start to get a rationalization of the types of data used across Office 365. Now, the rationalization is that people can start thinking of, okay, a document is used here. It's used as an attachment in email, used as a document, an item inside SharePoint and OneDrive. OneNote can also be a document. And you start thinking about what that document is, and we start to see things like the Fluid Foundation, which is presenting a vision of what the next generation of those documents might be. You just think of them as XML containers, and inside that XML container, you've got all massive different type of information. But then you have other things like tasks, and tasks is a very good example because when you think about your Outlook tasks, your to-do items, your tasks in team, your planner items, project, etc. So lots of different ways to capture a piece of work that needs to be done and record as progress. And what's happening now is that we're heading very quickly to a single task object, and that single task object will be exposed in To-Do, it will be exposed in Outlook, it will be exposed in Planner, and so forth and so on. And this is what's happening all the time as Microsoft works their way through the various types of objects that are used inside Office 365. We talked about the storage. It's a common repository. Don't think of it as Exchange mailbox databases. They are mailboxes, they are databases, but Microsoft just refers to it as substrate storage. They just think of it as interacting with the database, which is the right way to think about it. The access to the data through a common interface, that's the graph. And over the last while, we've seen an explosion in the number of graph APIs that are available. People are getting their heads around the graph. They're figuring out that, hey, the graph is a pretty good way of getting that information in a way that maybe we haven't been able to get at before. And it's also given us a lot of connected information, which is also interesting. Instead of using one technique to interact with Teams and another interact with SharePoint, I now use the same technique, same programming capabilities to interact with both. Then it also, because we're building this common repository, that allows huge scope to create new applications. You know what the repository is, you know what the data is inside the applications, you know what the API for those that data is. So therefore, you can start saying, well, what could I do with this? And this is where the Fluid Foundation comes in, because the Fluid Foundation allows us to think about, well, okay, I've got different pieces of application data here, and I make an update to them. The updates all flow back through the substrate, so therefore that means that anybody who's connected to the substrate can see the update in almost real time. And then the last thing is, because the substrate is drawing information from all around Office 365, it gives Microsoft this huge data set for machine learning. And when it comes to AI and machine learning, the bigger the data set you have, the more precise you're going to be, the less mistakes you're going to make, the fewer false positives you're going to have. There's a lot of goodnesses that you'll see so many more edge cases and so forth and so on. So developing the substrate has been a huge task that Microsoft has been engaged on for probably the last 4 or 5 years, and we are really seeing coming into play now. This is going to be the biggest influence over the long term on how people interact and work with and program against and manage Office 365. So it's not just for organizations like yourselves, it's also for the ISV community, because of course the ISV community is going to think about how they can take whatever they're offering, whatever functionality, added value, things that Microsoft simply doesn't do, how they can move that forward to deal with the world where the substrate is the predominant influence on everything that happens with Office 365. So it's a really interesting time that we're living in. I think over the next 5 years, you can see the completion of this vision. And eventually, you might even say that at that stage there will be one kind of substrate, and all of the, perhaps even the individual application databases will be gone. But who cares? Because it's all background engineering. It's all plumbing. And in the cloud, when you buy a cloud service, you don't really care what the plumbing is as long as the cloud delivers. So that's pretty well what I would have to say on that. So in conclusion, the two sides of the house. We've had an explosion of interest, stress, and strain, demand on Office 365. It is a huge challenge, and it seems to pass the test. There are stress points, absolutely. There were little cracks appeared, absolutely. Some of those cracks were painful for people, you bet your bottom dollar. But the point is, things didn't collapse, we kept working. So that was pretty good. And going forward, as I said, the new applications features you're going to see over the next number of years, they're going to depend on a combination of machine learning, AI, graph, and the substrate. That's the magic trinity for Office 365 going forward. Okay, Jennifer, that's all I had to say. Now, let's take any questions.
Yes, yes. I have a couple here that I want to ask. Okay, good. This one I missed earlier. My apologies. So regarding, changes in, the strain put on Office 365 services, you mentioned that machine learning scale back. So we have a question. Would that machine learning scale back hurt Office 365 security and compliance services? So any machine learning used around spam, phishing, filters, quarantine items, etc.
No, no, I don't. I really don't believe so. Any indication I've got from Microsoft is that it's kind of the machine learning that's for some of their newer applications that they're working on. I mean, they're working on public previews, for example, of how to apply protection encryption to data uh, at mass. So let's say you're an organization that's got 250,000 SharePoint documents. To ask a user to go and apply a sensitivity label to each one of those documents would be a task that would be very boring, very mundane, and would never get done. But if you can build AI and build models that will understand what your information is and what's stored in all the different sites across your tenant, you can then have background processes that will go and search for matching documents, all the variations of a document, like a purchase order or a travel request or a HR review or something like that, and apply the appropriate sensitivity label to them. So that's one thing where they'd be scaling back. You might have heard about Project Cortex, which is a big new SharePoint development. Again, that depends on a lot of machine learning to understand about things like what does an acronym mean? What terms does a company use inside the general course of day-to-day business? So that kind of stuff has been tuned back because it's still under development. It's not a production system. But production systems like advanced threat protection, things that anything to do with security, you can be absolutely sure that it has not been scaled back at all.
That's certainly reassuring then. A question regarding, I think, your second half of your presentation. So this is from Lucas. Hi, Lucas. Lucas is one of our longtime CAB members. She says, with the shift in moving everything toward ESE and the long history of Exchange being a high-value target for malicious actors and the condensing of access methods to graph, what efforts are happening in tandem to better secure homogeneous data?
Would you like to define what you mean by homogeneous data? You mean the data belonging to an individual? Do we have some more clarification? This is where a face-to-face meeting really supports.
Yes, if we had this in Teams. Let me see if Lucas can unmute himself. Okay, he says just data with a common storage methodology.
The thing is, it's not going to get any worse than it is today, and it's probably going to get better because, again, you will have extra intelligence that will be able to fill in the gaps where humans make mistakes. This doesn't mean that you're ever going to take humans out of the equation, because I don't think you will. You always need to have somebody looking after the machines, otherwise we end up with Skynet. But I do think you'll get better protection over the long term. Of course, we'll have to wait and see, but that's my belief.
All right. Brad says, to what extent do you think Microsoft will make the information it collects through the substrate available to third parties for analysis, or be able to consume it through Microsoft machine learning offerings?
Well, the data is all in graph. The graph is publicly available. Let's say there are a huge number of public graph API endpoints. So those endpoints are available to allow people to gather stuff and use them. So, for example, you could use graph calls to grab all the Exchange storage information, SharePoint storage information, SharePoint 5 usage information, and stuff it into whatever repository you wanted to, like Splunk or anything else. to go and analyze it to your heart's content. You can do that. Those public APIs are all available. All you need to write is a little bit of code. You can even do it with PowerShell. The question might be that some of the more interesting material might not be accessible. And that could be either because Microsoft has made a decision not to make that accessible, or they're working on the API. I mean, there's a lot of graph APIs in beta as well. So you end up with a V1 version and a beta version. And sometimes you need to go to the beta version of the endpoint to get some extended information. But I think they're really serious about making as much stuff available out of the graph as possible. And so that means that the question then becomes, firstly, what do I know? What do I think I need to know? Second thing is, where can I get the underlying data out of the graph? Which one of the endpoints, or which combination of endpoints? Because a lot of the endpoints are pretty specific to a certain kind of data. And then the third thing would be, well, where do I put the data when I've retrieved it from the graph? And then the fourth thing is, well, once I've put the data somewhere safe, what do I do with it? How do I analyze it? But the data's there, it's in the graph. It's going to be in the graph. That's why it's a single API. That's the beauty of it.
Right. If anybody wants to ask any more questions, please put those in the Q&A right now. I'm going to ask one question here, Tony. Given your interaction with clients you consult with through social media, I guess right now, what's the biggest thing you're asked about with regards to Office 365 management in terms of this crisis? Is there anything that people are coming to you and asking you about repeatedly right now, during this crisis as it relates to Office 365?
Some questions about license management. A company might have made a big investment in licenses, and they've allocated them, and all of a sudden they need more licenses. They don't want to go and give Microsoft a whole hunk of change. So there's been a number of questions of, how do I identify people who aren't using licenses, because I'd really like to reuse those licenses. So that's one thing I've seen. I've seen a lot of questions asking about why things aren't working, and some of the reasons why things aren't working is that there are these transient errors, or because Microsoft has throttled something back. An example of that is that Microsoft had introduced in Teams and this notion of suggested entries in your activity feed, which is kind of like information that we've picked out of all of the teams that you subscribe to, that you're a member of, that we think would be interesting for you. Well, those type of notifications have disappeared for the moment because that feature was turned off. They also have to turn off things like the red receipt feature in Teams in Europe. That's coming back. So people have been asking, why aren't things working? And in some cases, it's a matter of, well, try it again in a few minutes. In other cases, it's, well, that feature, by the way, has just been turned off for the moment. Microsoft hasn't done a great job, I've got to say, in communicating the exact features that have been turned off, or the ones that have been slowed down. They've made some public commentary about things like, the definition of meeting recordings going to 720p, but at the level of detail that caused people to worry and file help desk reports, they haven't really given out as much information as I would have liked.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I would think that last one is very pertinent. The first one you mentioned, license management, are folks concerned about like in a month from now or a couple of weeks from now getting a really big bill from Microsoft?
Well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is that they might find that they have a whole heap of users who need to now use a particular thing. So you might, for example, find that you want to have users using, I mentioned conditional access policies. That's a good example early on. Okay, so what conditional access policies do I need? Well, now do I need Azure AD premium licenses? Okay, let's have a look at what we've got in the pot versus what we need to use. Who needs to get that protection? Another thing too is that a lot of the features that you'll hear Microsoft making a big deal of are actually Office 365 E5 features. So people say, well, do we need that? Do we really need that, or is it a must-have? Is it something that we can live without? And if some people need it, well, how many E5 licenses do I need? Should I buy Microsoft 365 E5, or do I just need Office 365 E5? So licensing is a horrible, complex area, and you should. It's like you should probably, you talk to your bank manager if you're going to get a loan. Well, you go talk to a licensing professional if you're going to sort out your licensing, because it can be a real mess.
I think there's a whole group of Gartner analysts dedicated to just license management. So
Yep. Yeah.
it's definitely a complex
There's no doubt
area.
you can spend a whole pile of money that you don't need. But the other caution I give is that you can actually incur a liability that you don't realize, and that is when an administrator might enable a feature, and they don't realize that that feature requires a particular license, and then there's a lot of places, and you'll see in the Microsoft the documentation where they say, well, by the way, we don't have the capability to turn features on and off because of license at the moment, but we probably have it in the future. So you can get yourself into a situation where two things happen. One is you've incurred a liability for a whole pile of licenses, and the second thing is that all of a sudden, when Microsoft does come up with the code to control access to a feature on a license by license basis, they enable that, and you lose a lot of functionality that perhaps the business processes were built around. That also speaks to the need to understand what features you're using inside Office 365, understand the licenses you need for those features, and make sure that you have those licenses in place and allocated to the right people.
Excellent. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in right now. Tony, I appreciate your time on this. I think this is really valuable information. I've had a few private chats, folks already sharing their appreciation. So let me just share my appreciation for your time and educating
Sure.
us about this, especially as you mentioned, Microsoft hasn't, made a lot of public comments about the service interruptions or what things they've turned off. So this has been really helpful.
Well, to be fair, they've been keeping the things going, so I wouldn't be too
Yes.
hypercritical of them. Thanks be to God, they kept things going,
Yes, exactly. Well, I appreciate time. For those on the phone, I really appreciate your time and attention to this. If I can figure out how to get the recording after here, I will attempt to send that out to those who gave their email when they signed in. And then just for one other piece, two other pieces of information. As I mentioned, Tony here is one of our Tech 2019 and our upcoming Tech 2020 speakers. So make sure you check out theexpertsconference.com. A lot of this type of information is what we share through that conference. It's very much a tech conference, not a Quest conference. And so make sure you take a look at that. And then we also are planning to do one more of these on April 15th, focus very specifically on Azure Active Directory. And we'll be bringing in another expert, another tech speaker, Sean Metcalf, to talk specifically about Azure Active Directory and some of those things you really need to keep your eye on right now. We're all really busy trying to enable that remote workforce. What are those things within Active Directory you really have to keep your eye on? All right. Well, thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.